Thanks, Dan, for that reminder. So up first, we're going to have Michelle. So Michelle is from Lynn. She's currently the public health director in Lynn since 2016. She has a master's degree in healthcare management and as previously a nursing home administrator for 20 years. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Michelle.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Beth. Good morning, everybody. I think that we all will agree that we still are learning a lot from COVID-19, and hopefully within the next year, we can say that we already know what we need to know and what we didn't know back in when the pandemic started. So with that being said, Lynn had put together, when this first started, the Department of Public Health in Lynn consisted of myself and MJ Alexander, the public health nurse. So we were trying to put together a contact tracing team, which we did, and we were able to hire a wonderful addition to our team, Jennifer Almonte, who is a public nurse with us now also. So with our contact tracing, we were getting up to 100 to 200 cases a day. And with that, we found that there were 3 important areas that really needed addressing. First was the interview part, where you found the isolation and quarantine was an issue, due to difficult living arrangements. Then the transportation, we set up with Revere, Chelsea, and Everett for sharing a hotel. So we were able to provide isolation and quarantine for those who were not able to isolate and quarantine themselves from their families. Transportation was set up also to and from the hotel during that time. And our biggest issue that we found was the food insecurity impact on Lynn, that food insecurity in Lynn had increased to 120%. And due to the diverse population that we have, it was just really quite noticeable during the pandemic. And due to the, existing public health and social determinants of health, we found that residents were limited to fresh produce, higher rates also of substance abuse disorder, housing insecurity, the undocumented status were definitely exacerbated, and the economic impacts of the COVID spread. Next slide, please, Beth. So Lynn put together, Mayor McGee had asked that we put together a food security task force. Norris Guscott, who at the time was the director of the Mass in Motion program, is our leader with that. And he has done a great job. And the goal of the food security task force was to have one centralized location and one central contact. So we were getting asks from all over. We were getting asked from the senior housing. We were trying to, put together a plan for the students so that they could, still have access to food. We also were working with different agencies around Lynn. So from that, next slide, please, Beth. From that, and the security task force was put together, we were able to identify the gaps, the issues, and the trends to try to make sure that all residents that we were able to accommodate had some sort of food during this pandemic, as everything had closed down and people were afraid to, leave their house. So we would meet and we would discuss, how we would try to set up some sort of food drives. And then don't forget, because then you had to, at the time we didn't know, so you had to wipe everything down. And then we also were able to collaborate and share information with the Massachusetts Food Policy Council, Senator Brenda Crichton, and the Mass Food System Collaborative. And from that, we were able to set up in the Lynn schools. Lynn has 28 schools. We were able to set up a grab and go process for them so that students were able to come to the schools that they attended and get food for 2 to 3 days at a time. Greater Lynn Senior Services set up was set up as a grab and go also for the seniors who were able to get to Bliss. Church pantries were set up. St. Stephen's in Lynn has one of the biggest ones, and the Salvation Army, which was right next door to City Hall, was very involved in food distribution also. Next slide, please. So these are our task force members. We found that it was really important to make sure that we tried to cover every area of the population in Lynn, you know, whether it was different, as we were getting asks from all over. So we Norris put together the task force team, and these are some of the members who were part of it. To this day, every Wednesday at 2 o'clock, the food security team does still meet to discuss food issues that do go on with that. So all of these members from the city were part of it, and Norris still does head up the task force at that time. Next slide, please. From this food security task force, we were able to serve over 1.3 million pounds of food to residents during the height of COVID. And we were able to utilize we did follow the guidelines from CDC and the Mass Department of Public Health and Governor Baker's administration. We were able to craft guidelines that helped us to have a regular in-person social farmers market during the height of it, where downtown in Lynn, near the parking garage, we were able to host our farmers market, which at that time, you know, everyone's wearing a mask, everyone was social distance, everyone had gloves. There was one person assigned to each kiosk, for lack of a better word, and only one person, you know, was doing the touching. And so that was really very, very successful, and it has led us into our launch of the Phoenix Food Hub, which we are working with GLIS, Greater Lynn Senior Services, Catholic Charities, to put together, where we are going to have like a one-stop shopping, and we are going to have a community kitchen and a food pantry. There'll be a dietitian, a nutritionist, a nurse, program space. There'll also be an area where meals will be cooked separately for, you know, vegetarian meals or religious meals. We'll be able to dedicate, you know, to make sure that we are accommodating everybody in Lynn. The food delivery options have increased by 40%. The city has also put together an online ordering system, and we have done well with, and I should say Norris gets a lot of the kudos, because he has been able to obtain a private grant and fundings for the city, and with that. So I will thank you. And next slide, I think there's one more slide, Beth. Thank you. Just if you have any questions or concerns, you know, Norris is the guru with this, but I am happy to answer any questions that you have at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle.
Okay, thanks everyone. Sorry for trying to unmute button. All right, thank you, Michelle. Yes, as she had mentioned, if there are questions, please put them in the chat and we will get to them. You know, or if as they come up again, put them in there and we can answer them at the end. So up next we have Ron, and Ron is the Chief Administrative Officer at Cataldo EMS, currently serves as the Vice Chair of the American Ambulance Association Workforce Committee. He previously served as the Chair of the Board of Directors for the Metro Boston EMS Council and as the Chair of the Pre-Hospital Committee. He also serves as the Vice President of the Massachusetts Ambulance Association and as a Region 1 representative for American Ambulance Association Board of Directors. So Ron, go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Beth. Good morning, everyone. Just going to take the next 10 minutes or so just to talk through some of the challenges that emergency medical services have faced over the last year and the lessons we learned, I guess, as we continue to try and navigate this uncharted water. Next slide, please. So this is a little tough to see, but it gives you an understanding of how the ambulance services are made up in the US. This is as of April 2021. So about 40% of ambulance services are run by municipal fire service. 18% are from private ambulance services like a Cataldo. And then the rest of the pie kind of breaks down by third-party service, government service, police departments, and others. Next slide, please. So the most significant impact I think we have had, ambulance services or emergency medical services over the last year, has been staffing. Staffing has been declining over many years now in our field, but the last year has really taken its toll. Some of the causes we believe is the stress of the unknown. As our field providers respond to these requests for service, responding to the unknown, not knowing if each patient that they interact with potentially has COVID, the demand on them to have to don and doff personal protective equipment every time they respond to a call, the time they need to protect themselves, their partners, and as importantly, the patient. Creating barriers in the ambulance to keep the cab of the ambulance safe, and having to decon the vehicle after every call. These are things that are done, but not to the extent that we've needed to during the pandemic. So it's created quite a bit of stress on the employees. And then the repeated testing that we're being asked to do when we have a suspected exposure. And then the continuous mask wearing has been stressful. And then the unknown of bringing the potential exposure COVID to your family. So many of our staff had to either stay at a hotel or a separate part of their residence to avoid exposing their family or young children to a potential exposure. So it's been very stressful. The fluctuating call volume, we found early on in the pandemic that patients were afraid to activate the 911 system because they felt like if they went to the hospital, they were going to get COVID. So they were waiting longer to activate the 911 system. And we found that these patients were much sicker than traditional 911 activations. The burnout is high. Like many other industries, we're trying to do more with less. And the field staff are really just getting tired. The compensation, unfortunately, in our industry isn't great. That's due to reimbursement being structured the way it is through Medicare and Medicaid. So we have kind of a fixed reimbursement. So we don't have a lot of wiggle room to do more on the front end for our field staff. So they're looking for other career opportunities. And prior to the pandemic, but it certainly impacts us, is there was a reduction in the number of training institutions where we train our EMTs and paramedics. The state required training institutions to become accredited, and many of the smaller training centers couldn't fulfill the obligation to become accredited. So they closed down. So there were fewer sites for us to send folks to become an EMT and or a paramedic. Next slide, please. So the staffing shortage has resulted in a significant change in the way we deliver our service. Several years ago, ambulance services were well staffed, and when a customer called and this is more for the non-emergent work than the emergent work. But if a hospital system were to call to move a patient back to a skilled nursing facility or to another tertiary care center, typically an ambulance would be there in 30 minutes. Now it's typically hours, and in some cases, it's not even that same day. The demand is exceeding the availability of ambulance resources, not only here in Massachusetts, but across the country. There are many of case studies that are being reported that even in 911 calls, patients are waiting upwards of an hour, if not greater, for an ambulance. Skilled nursing facilities are really suffering the most. Most ambulance services are contracted with major hospital systems, and they're trying to manage their demand. So the skilled nursing facilities trying to move patients to and from appointments and so forth could be waiting days. And it's really unfortunate, but the resource availability is just not there right now. The impact on the 911 system, again, fewer ambulances, increased response times, the demand for more mutual aid. That's when one community may call upon another to assist them because their ambulance is not available, or what they're used to for backup resources just aren't there today because of the staffing challenges. And ambulances are responding from a further distance, so creating a longer response time. Next slide, please. So the solution, we really need to create staff, more EMTs and paramedics. So we have taken the initiative to offer accelerated EMT programs. So traditionally there are two types of EMT programs. One's full-time Monday through Friday, typically done in about 6 weeks. We're offering that to folks who are interested. We're actually paying them for the 6 weeks to sit in a classroom. And then when they graduate, they'll be elevated to starting rate for an emergency medical technician. Or the other type of EMT program is usually 2 evenings a week and some Saturdays over the course of about 3 months. And we can offer employment for those folks while they train. They could drive a chair car or do other tasks for us so they can earn while they go to that longer EMT program. We have offered and started to train some of our EMTs in advanced EMT training. This, as the title says, speaks for itself, an EMT with some advanced skill set. They're not quite a paramedic, but they're kind of in between an EMT and a paramedic. That would help us to offset some of the paramedic shortages. They would be paired with paramedics, and they'd be able to do some of the skills that a paramedic is able to do. And we are an accredited training center, so our training center is offering EMT, and in 2022, we'll be offering paramedic training. So we'll offer that to our internal staff and then anyone outside. State waivers are being offered right now, so we're able to staff, the Department of Public Health has offered ambulance services to staff ambulances with a first responder and an EMT. Typical minimum staffing is 2 EMTs. So a first responder is someone who's trained in a 16-hour course. They would more or less operate the vehicle, and then the EMT would be in the back with the patient. So we're looking at that as alternative ways to staff more vehicles. There's a lot of involvement from the Massachusetts Ambulance Association. Dennis Cataldo, the owner of our organization, is the president, as well as the American Ambulance Association, both at the state and federal level, working to address that issue I mentioned before, which is reimbursement. We need to see an increase in our reimbursement from Medicare and Medicaid in order to help offset some of the staffing challenges we have today. And lastly, technology. So we are competitors with the other private ambulance services in the area, but we do work collaboratively. And we've built Cataldo, a piece of technology that allows us to let other private services join this consortium, if you will, and it displays available resources on a map across the state. So dispatch centers could see, although we might not have an ambulance for a particular call, the ambulance service X might have one sitting down the street that we could call upon to utilize, and we could help them backfill maybe the next call that they were going to do. So we're excited about this technology, and we're just trying to think outside the box and work more collaboratively with the other services. And then the last slide, please. Just kind of a takeaway. So with the pandemic, the COVID vaccine, we have mandated that our staff, because we're getting requests from most major hospital systems, that in order for us to be providing service to them, our staff need to be vaccinated. So 10/15 is our cutoff, that all staff need to be vaccinated. We are fortunate that of about 850 field providers, only 26 are not vaccinated. Those 26 are made up of religious, medical reasons, and or they just flat out refuse to. So we're meeting with those individuals over the next couple of weeks, working with them, and then we'll decide what the end result is in the next 2 weeks. But we've had a good response from our staff, which is great. So thanks for the time this morning. Any questions, we'll be happy to answer at the end. And I apologize I didn't put my contact information there, but I'd be happy to put it in the chat if anyone has any questions afterwards. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Ron. Yeah, as Ron had mentioned, again, if anyone has any questions, please place them in the chat. We're going to get to them at our question and answer period. Next up, we have Nick from Lowell General. So Nick serves as the manager of emergency planning and preparedness for Circle Health Lowell General Hospital. Nick has been with the hospital for 8 years. And throughout Lowell General's response to COVID, Nick served as the hospital's liaison officer.
Great. Thank you, Beth. And good morning, everybody. And thanks for having me on this morning to be able to present this, which I think is a super important topic because, field hospitals don't get stood up every day. It's not often that these happen. But I think it's ultimately a critically important capability for our region to be able to have. So next slide, please, Beth. So just a quick background on how we got to the point of standing up a field hospital. So starting back in the spring of 2020, March 2020, when the pandemic's first wave was really starting to spike. At the time, our president and CEO served as the MHA chair. So he was working with work groups and other leaders across the state and at government levels on, trying to game plan what, high level courses of action healthcare facilities could take to, help, the regions and the state respond to the pandemic. So as you heard in the news back then, field hospitals were starting to be put up, some, in the greater Boston area, the Worcester area, down at the Cape. But there was kind of a gap when you looked at a map in our region. At the time, I don't believe there was any, talks of that. So, trying to, plan and put our heads together on, what we could do to, emulate that. That was the answer, trying to figure out, how to put up a field hospital for, Region 3 that could serve, our area. So ultimately, we got the go ahead. We worked with MEMA, the city of Lowell, Umass Lowell, and other partners on one, identifying what a good spot would be, and then two, how to, stand it up. So ultimately, the Umass Lowell Campus Recreation Center was identified, and I'll explain why. But big picture, for the first wave, we didn't actually see any patients there because if you recall, during the first wave, the highest demand was for ICU beds and ventilators, and ultimately a field hospital, the one that we put up, wasn't really appropriate, didn't necessarily have the capabilities for taking an ICU level patient. So ultimately, we weren't able to really see any patients there for that, for the first wave. Fast forward a few months, as wave 2 started to really gain momentum, it became clear that Region 3 in our area was going to start to see some significant capacity constraints again. So the state government reached out to us, asked us to stand up the field hospital again, this time with the expectation that we're definitely going to end up, we're going to be caring for patients this time around. Next slide, please. So ultimately, we were back at the Umass Lowell Campus Recreation Center. As you can see here on the picture, it's outlined there. A couple things I wanted to point out why this building was such a great spot was because on the picture, you can see the building kind of looks like it's broken up into two major sections. One of them being that kind of a rectangular section that you see that's sideways on the picture. If you can imagine that whole area is one giant open room, it's actually 3 full-size basketball courts all next to each other. And then one thing that made that great was, one, because it was such a wide open area, we could kind of do what we needed to with it, but it was, the nature of the building, it was separated from the other parts of the building as well. And that includes the air handling systems. So the air handlers that serviced the gymnasium area was completely separate and isolated from the air handlers that serviced the rest of the building, which made it ultimately that area the ideal clinical space in this building, the ideal building for standing up a field hospital in order to respond to the COVID-19 or any pandemic. And also, I'll point out too that this building, it's located on Umass Lowell's East Campus, which is the university's campus for several dorm buildings and other recreational facilities. You see the baseball field up there and some recreational soccer fields. So there's plenty of space, plenty of room to work with. So ultimately making it an ideal spot. Next slide, please. So just some general information about the site and what we were looking for. Ultimately, it served as a low acuity, short-term medical facility for low acuity patients, but all of which were COVID-19 positive. And most importantly, serving as a regional resource, not only just for Lowell General, but for the region to support other healthcare facilities, throughout the region in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Ultimately, it was a 63-bed unit with the ability to surge up to 77 beds, but those were broken down into 4 different pods, A, B, C, and D. And each one of those pods could be activated independently based on the needs at that time. So when we activated, we start at A pod, and then if and when the demand would grow, we could expand that opening or flex it down if needed. And then ultimately, it was treated as if it were any satellite site or off-site facility from a hospital in the sense of emergencies. So if there are any emergencies of any nature, those would be handled through a 911 activation. Next slide, please. So just a quick overview from the outside, starting from the outside, working our way in. One of the first things we wanted to do was develop an overall parking plan right from the early beginning of the planning stages, because knowing that, we were sort of borrowing this building from the university, it was outside of the hospital. We wanted to be mindful and respectful of, the property that we were using. We wanted to make sure that, things were as organized as possible. There wasn't necessarily any chaos with traffic or anything, because, for the build, there was going to be box trucks, tractor trailers coming and going, staff coming and going. So we put we worked with the university on figuring out a parking plan. Also being mindful that, this was last winter, so the majority of the students weren't on site because they were on either winter break, or at the time, in-person learning had really been scaled down because of the pandemic. But there were still some students on site. So we, again, wanting to be mindful of that and being respectful, making sure that we were organized, starting right from the outside at the very beginning. Next slide, please. We also needed to, one of the early stages, develop where we were going to have our patients entering and exiting when they arrived by ambulance or when they were discharged and getting picked up to go home. So the spot that you see in the picture on the left picture, that's ultimately where we figured out where it would be the best spot for an ambulance bay to be stood up. As you can imagine, a gym or a room that size is going to have several emergency exits. This particular exit was double wide, and ultimately it was pretty close to the rear entrance of the staff parking lot. And then the picture on the right, you can see we had a tent put up that served as an anteroom of the ambulance bay. So when a patient arrived via EMS, you can see on that picture as well, there's a little thing circled in red. That's actually a Ring camera. So when EMS would arrive with the patient, they would ring the Ring doorbell, which would go to iPads that were set up at the nursing stations, and then they could be granted access from there. Next slide, please. So this picture I wanted to put up just so we had these emergency layout maps created and blown up. They were posted all over the place because once the construction was complete, it was no longer a wide open room. The partitions, which you'll see in some pictures coming up, were about 10 feet tall. So it could get kind of confusing if you didn't really know where you were going there. So we definitely wanted to make sure everyone knew of all the emergency exits and the emergency layout. But also, I think this picture is a good depiction of how the clinical zone was separated from the non-clinical zone. Next slide, please. Then getting into the utilities and how we manage that. The picture on the left, you can see those three big green generators. We had those, so those are supplied by a contractor. And those mainly supplied the interior core of the clinical zone, all the patient bays, so all 77 patient bays that were stood up. They had quad outlets run to them, which gave the ability for bedside lighting and lamps, ability to charge O2 concentrators or cell phones or iPads or any other kind of devices. One thing I'll note too about that, so there's three generators there. Primarily, that was all run by two generators, the third one being a backup generator. So that way, if the two generators failed or one of the two generators that were the primary generators failed, the third one would automatically kick on and would still be able to run the interior core of the clinical zone for the patient bays, just at a slightly lower level. And then the other components of power, we use the building power to power all of the medical equipment we had there. We had portable x-rays, omnicells, which are the medication storage units, computers, refrigerators, and so on. The building itself was also on a backup generator. So again, in the wintertime, if there was a storm or something that knocked out power, we still had 100% backup power capabilities. In the picture on the right, you see there, that's an example of one of our hand washing stations. We literally sent facilities to Home Depot and Lowe's and told them, try to find what you can for sinks. And you can see there in the picture, that's what we were able to find. Key component there, we were able to work with the university's contracted plumbers to run the piping that you see on the gym wall from their plumbing, from their water sources to the hand washing stations. And then also using that the PVC piping that you see as a drainage system that we were able to get approval or sign off on from the plumbing inspector that we could run right to the city's sewer drainage system. And I'll explain a little more about that in a few minutes. Next slide, please. Here you just see just an outline of the clinical floor plan. As I mentioned before, the clinical area, all the patient bays were broken down into 4 different sections, A, B, C, and D. A being our primary section, so that when we opened up, we would start there and just kind of scale up or scale down as needed. And then all the perimeter bays, they, from the outside, they looked like they were patient bays, but those were all used for various reasons, whether it be storage, nursing stations, nourishment rooms, and so on. Next slide, please. Want to take a moment too to mention what we did around the flooring. So I mentioned earlier too that we stood this up beforehand in the spring of 2020. And on the left picture, you can see kind of in the middle in the upper section, you can see a red tarp type material that's laid down on the floor. The first time around, that's all we had laid down. So there were some concerns there that there wasn't enough protection. Fortunately, in a way, fortunately, we didn't see any patients there, so there was minimal activity for the first time around. So there wasn't any damage to the floor or anything. But this time around, having that in the back of our minds, knowing that we were more than likely going to see patients, we needed to figure out what to do to really increase the protection of the flooring. Because, again, we had portable x-rays and, heavy patient beds that were on wheels. So we didn't want to damage that floor. So we worked with the contractor that was there to help us, supplied through MEMA, through their help. We worked with them on coming up with a good flooring plan. So you can see there in the left picture, kind of what it looked like as it was going down. If you can picture kind of like a linoleum or a vinyl type material, before anything was even built, we had that covering the entire surface of the gym area, which was a huge improvement from the first time around. Next slide, please. So this picture just kind of shows a depiction I mentioned earlier of how tall those partitions really were. So you can see here, they're about 10 feet tall. So that called for a lot of signage to be ordered and placed. And it was not just one order. It was, we ordered some signs, and then a few days later, it's all right, we need to order more because something else would come up that we realized needed, to be, standing out more. And a key component to that too, and I'll get into in a few minutes, is staff orientation, making sure they know where they are and what they're supposed to be doing, and so on, especially with that emergency layout. Next slide, please. Here's a picture of what one of the nursing stations looked like. As you can see, there's some computer screens and printers, and so basically what we wanted to do was ultimately use this as kind of like an annex of what we would have here at the hospital. So starting with our IT department, they worked with the UML IT department to really bring in, so they literally brought the Lowell General IT network to this building. So the Circle Health Wi-Fi was there, and all these printers were connected to the Lowell General network, which was, in my opinion, critically important because it made things very efficient for charting through the electronic medical record. So it really minimized the need for recording on paper and then having to, retroactively enter things into the system. The nursing staff, the clinical staff could do all of that right then and there without any hiccups. Next slide. Image here of just what one of the medication rooms look like. On the left side of this picture, you see those 3 storage units. Those are the Omni cells, what we use to control and store medications in. That was overseen and processed through our pharmacy department, which I'll talk a little more about in a minute. But again, just showing a picture of what this capability we had for medication management. Next slide, please. So overall, this is just an overall overhead picture of what the clinical zone looked like. It looks quite busy. And again, the partitions, each cubicle was about 10 by 10 wide and about 10 feet tall. So not your average gym there. Next picture, please. All right, so now we have the field hospital stood up. Now it's, how do we run it? How do we operationalize it? And that was, in a way, depending on how you look at it, some of the most challenging parts of the whole thing. You can build it, but now you got to run it smoothly and make sure that it's sustainable and and smooth as possible. So first and foremost, starting with clinical staffing, which was one of our biggest concerns, because as you all can imagine, at the time, all of our current staff were flat out. They're all working where they're supposed to be. We had really no opportunities to float any staff from our inpatient hospitals over to working here. So we had to find clinical staffing that could operate this place. And we had to look outside for that. And we were able to contract that out, which was super helpful. But now there's a whole other component of, we need to onboard them, orient them, train them, really get them up to what we're expecting to be, for as a healthcare, as a nurse or a tech or an aide from the hospital standpoint, and get them up to our standards and making sure that they know how to, do our processes, especially with charting and so on and so on. Then we had to figure out, a good staffing plan and staffing models for each of those pods that I had shown you earlier. So there was a lot of work around that, processes and procedures with our nursing education department. We had people identified that would oversee, clinical leadership and scheduling, but there was a lot behind the scenes to make that part of it function. Another huge component, admission criteria. We wanted to make sure that we weren't accepting patients that were outside of the scope of the capabilities of this facility. So, working with our doctors and clinical staff and our continuity of care staff to make sure that, we had a very thorough admission criteria put in place. So the most appropriate patients were sent there. Okay, now we have that admission criteria. Now we had to figure out, okay, what's the process going to be for transferring internal and external patients? Internal being, what's the process for if we have a patient at Lowell General Hospital? What do we go through to get them sent to this site? Now, and then an even bigger component, other regional hospitals, what's the process going to look like to, get that going? So a lot of work with our COC staff on that as well, making sure that the process was smooth and standard and that it worked, as good as it could. Then I mentioned earlier about the ambulance bay, something as simple as patient arrival. There's a lot that goes into something that seems, something that we don't realize is just, it's standard operating procedure on a daily basis, but standing up a field hospital, something like this is kind of a big deal because, you have to make sure that it's as smooth right from the door, all through the patient's care and their treatment there. Food services was another big one. Again, like everyone else, our staff was dedicated to what they needed to be doing at the hospitals. So we needed contracted help. This was through the university, they helped prepare all the patient meals and everything. But then we still had to figure out processes for how do those meals get delivered? Where do they get dropped off, and who's going to be responsible for picking them up and bringing them to the patient? So a lot of work went, behind the scenes to figure that out. Environmental services, something as simple as, who's going to empty the trash cans and who's going to throw them, the bags in the dumpsters and whatnot. So we needed contracted help for, environmental service workers and so on. Security was another huge component. Back then, standing up, a facility like this, we had to figure out, how we were going to keep it secure. At the time, our own security services, again, broken record, were dedicated to the inpatient hospitals, so we couldn't necessarily relocate them to here at the field hospital. So not only were we feeling, the staffing constraints, but some of the security contractors themselves were also feeling the staffing constraints. So, asking for, a contractor to help us staff a field hospital with 24/7 staffing coverages wasn't as easy as it seemed. So we had to go with, multiple different companies. We had a company for our entry points, making sure that everyone who was entering, the clean zone or the clinical zone, the normal staff entrance, were authorized and they were allowed to be there, because we weren't allowing visitors, just, for patient care. In the clinical zone, we had specialized security that we hired out for, dedicated just to the clinical zone. They had healthcare security experience, so we worked with a company for that. And then lastly, UMLPD, they helped us with, doing rounds around the perimeter of the building and from the outside. Next slide, please. Also, a few more points here. So we had lab capabilities, but then coming up with a process for, go back one, please. Sorry, thanks. Coming up with a process for, once the labs are drawn, where they're going to be left and who's going to be picking them up and what kind of schedules that going to look like. So a lot of work went there. Pharmacy, I showed you a picture of the medication room earlier. There was a huge component. We needed our own pharmacy staff to come on site themselves and manage those machines and manage those supply levels. And then, case management, they were hugely involved in the processes around, I mentioned earlier, the internal and external transferring process, and then radiology as well. Like mentioned earlier, we had portable X-ray capabilities, which having the Lowell General Network set up was so nice because, we were able to upload it. I don't believe we actually had to use the X-ray machine, but if we needed to, we had the capabilities to upload those results through the network instead of doing anything through manual paper processes. Next slide, please. So communications was one of the foundational pieces of making this work. We had to make sure staff knew, had multiple ways of communicating with each other. When you have such a giant, clinical zone that was cordoned off and barriered from the non-clinical zone, we needed, to have ways in place for staff to communicate each other in between those zones. So starting with, as simple as two-way portable radios, we made sure that all the clinical leaders had them. The security staff at all points had them. And we made sure, making sure that staff knew how to use them, radio etiquette and reviewing, just the basic concepts around that. I mentioned earlier that we had the Circle Health Network, which was huge because it allowed us to use our internal ASCOM phones and voice over IP phones. The ASCOM phones you see, that's that blue phone in the picture there. That works off of the Lowell General Network, and it's portable, it's mobile. So we had plenty of those that IT were able to source for us. So that allowed staff to make, phone calls directly to each other without any issues. And then voice over IP phones, if we needed to use desktop phones for any reason, we had those there as well. Next slide, please. So real quick, getting into supplies and how we manage that. Again, a huge component of the operationalizing this. So understanding, we had a great relationship with DPH on this because they were involved in helping us, stand this up and operationalize it. So they understood that what we had at the hospitals for PPE, it was critically important that those supplies remain dedicated to that because it was, all hands on deck trying to source as much PPE as possible from, any avenue. So we didn't really have the ability to repurpose what we had at the hospitals. They had to be dedicated to there. And DPH understood that, which is great because we were able to use their channels for sourcing N95s and general PPE for the field hospital. MEMA has what's called a field box for general supplies, which we're able to use. That's where those two-way radios came from. Also basic consumables such as, shampoo, toothpaste, hand sanitizer, some of the basic stuff that would be needed. But the clinical supplies, those were sourced through Lowell General. We mimicked what we call a med surge setup, which is, to keep our par levels of basic clinical supplies as far, IVs and fluids and so on. And the clinical leaders managed and oversaw the supply levels of those medical supplies. Clinical leaders, I should mention, consisted of leaders from Lowell General Hospital, So they knew how to work with our supply chain on getting more supplies when the time came. And then for the PPE stocking and tracking, that was conducted by operation leaders. So for example, I would, each day or every other day go in and take account the old fashioned way of what we had left of PPE. So we could forecast and track and figure out when we need to order more and for how much. Next slide, please. So what do we learn from all this? First and foremost, contractor relationships are so critically important for something like this. This wouldn't have been anywhere close to being possible if it weren't for outside help. And it could be, so maintaining good relationships with your contractors, and even, we always say, it's best to, start those relationships early before the emergency happens, through MOUs, but sometimes, we have to, start, we have to work with a brand new contractor, and in some examples we did here in the moment. So I would say, in that situation, be prepared to be flexible. Something like this, there's a lot of moving pieces. There's a lot of components that go into standing it up. And there were a lot of instances where we had to kind of pivot and change what we were asking the contractor to do. So we put in several change orders. And again, what I'm getting to is the relationship there is so important, because we want them to be on the same page as us and to understand, if we have to do any change orders or something like that, like why we're doing them. Also, I mentioned earlier, the plumbing inspector, he signed off and allowed us to drain the gray water into the city's sewer system. That wasn't necessarily a no-brainer answer, even though it was a pandemic, we were responding to an emergency. Excuse me. When he first realized that that's what our plan was, hopefully going to be, kind of, questioned it, sort of, was kind of, leery on it. And to his credit, that's his job, is to, our job is to do what we need to do to stand that up as quickly as possible to respond to the pandemic. His job's to make sure that from a plumbing perspective, things are being done, for the, within code or for safety reasons and whatnot. So we almost would have had a barrier. At the end of the day, they allowed us to do what we needed to do with the water drainage, and also the PEX piping, which isn't allowed in commercial buildings. But again, they allowed us to do that for the purposes of responding to the pandemic. But my point that I'm getting to is something where if you're going to stand up something like this, and it's going to require sign off from any kind of regulatory inspector, involve them early. If there's anything that you got to do that might potentially be outside of code, even the slightest, involve them early so they know and they're aware of what you're trying to do. So that way, if for some reason they come back and say, no, you can't do that, then, when, in the 11th hour, you're not stuck trying to change anything at the last minute. Because if we had to do that, because we didn't involve the inspectors until, the site was stood up and all we needed was their sign off. If they came back and said, no, we couldn't do that, then that would have delayed the opening and it would have thrown a wrench into the whole thing. And then staying true, if you come up with plans, do your best to stay true to them and, keep the consistency. There was an example of, I mentioned earlier, the admission criteria of, making sure that we had the most appropriate patients being cared for at the site, which was, critical. There was a situation where I'm not maybe someone who was involved in the transfer process was trying to, toe the line or so. I don't know. A patient wound up, being there. It wasn't, horrible, but they didn't necessarily, there was still some kind of red flags that they didn't necessarily meet the perfect criteria for being there. So out of an abundance of caution, we had to transfer them back to Lowell General Hospital. Point that I'm getting at is, nothing happened, but from that patient's perspective, I couldn't imagine what they were thinking. You transfer me to one place, now you transfer me back. It's like, what the heck are you guys doing? So one thing I would say with that is, if you come up with your plans, stay true to them and be consistent. And then lastly, I stole this quote from Forbes. In times like this, I don't think you can over communicate anything enough because, there's really no room for slip ups. We had a quick example there. I mentioned that we had a lot of contracted staff, particularly around the clinical staff. We, literally had to show them and onboard them every single thing to make sure that, all the everything was being accounted for. One thing we overlooked was something as simple as telling them that they didn't need to be told when to go in and do shift change. So one morning, myself and a couple of other operations leaders arrived, and there's a group of 15 nurses and other clinical staff all gowned up in their PPE, just standing there in the main lobby, which is where where everyone gowned up in the PPE getting ready to go in to the clinical zone. So they're all standing around, and it was 20 minutes past shift change, and we're like, what's going on? I'm like, oh, well, no one's here to tell us to go in. And we're like, you don't need to be told to go in, something as simple as that. And then they went in and did their shift change. But that, something as simple as that can't be over communicated, making sure that if you have staff that you're not familiar with, or they're not familiar with you, making sure that they know every last detail. So in summary, next slide, please. So in summary, we cared for 27 patients. Depending on how you look at it, it might not be a lot, it could be a lot. I know the field hospital in Worcester, I think, cared for several hundred, but for perspective, the most important thing is, we were able to serve the Region 3 hospitals, which again, I think is critically important for our region. And ultimately, we opened up in the first week of January, and we closed in February with the final closure and stand down on February 23rd. So thank you very much for listening. My contact information is there. Feel free to jot it down. If you have any questions or anything, shoot me an email, give me a phone call. If you have any questions for today, as we mentioned earlier, please just save them for the end. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Nick. As Nick mentioned, if there are any questions, please place them in the chat, and we'll get to them once all of the panelists are done presenting. So next up, we have Chuck, and Chuck is the CEO and Executive Director of New England Homes for the Deaf in Danvers. Chuck has been leading skilled nursing facilities, hospice, and assisted livings across the country for over the past 24 years. He has a bachelor's degree in various leadership program degrees as well. He also holds the certification of a certified director of assisted living, and is also a nursing home, a licensed nursing home administrator in Massachusetts. So if you want to take it away, Chuck.
Chuck, you're on mute.
All right, well, let's try again. Is that better?
Yes.
All right, and I said my best things already, so what can I say? So no, again, apologies. So good morning, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I realize that serving, trying to share everything about long-term care and COVID-19 in 10 minutes is really an impossible task. So I'm going to condense it down. I'm not going to be able to cover everything, but I put together this presentation just to kind of hit the high level things and the impact of today and how we have changed practices today. So long-term care and COVID-19, the ugly, the bad, and the good. So if I was really talented, in the background, there'd be Clint Eastwood music playing with the good, the bad, the ugly from the old Western, but I'm not that talented to do that. So, and I'm certainly not Clint Eastwood. So next slide, please. Waiting. All right. There we go. So that is me during COVID-19 at my last community. Bear in mind that I don't provide direct care. And that's what we were being asked to wear at the assisted living I was running at the time. A little bit about me, and I know you heard the introduction, but I did just want to share, originally from Virginia, hence I talk a little different than most people in the presentation, but have been in New England since 2001. Social worker by training, as Beth said, she held 24 years of healthcare leadership. Currently, I'm the CEO of New England Homes for the Deaf in Danvers, Massachusetts, and am learning ASL and having a wonderful opportunity here. Also wanted to put out that this presentation is certainly my experience, my lens and my optic. I tend to be an eternal optimist, so you'll probably be getting more of the good than really the bad and the tragedy. We will touch upon that, and there was certainly plenty of that in long-term care facilities. Also, in doing this presentation, did talk to some of my colleagues about what they would wish to share and the impact of COVID-19. Some things I'm not going to focus on the next few minutes, but is very, very relevant is kind of the chaos of directives, and it was no one's fault, and this is no way a criticism. But sometimes there was a lot of different messages that came out of the CDC. There was different messaging and rapidly changing messaging from DPH. And again, that's not a criticism. I think everyone was doing the best they could. We were getting new information. There was a lot of chaos that made day-to-day operations definitely a challenge. And I'm not going to touch upon that. I do believe everybody was doing their best. And I'm not going to touch upon vaccinations. And certainly that's kind of where we are now, the light at the end of the tunnel, if you will. But I'm going to focus on really what happened during the height of the COVID pandemic, if you will, and how it impacted long-term care facilities. Next slide, please. The ugly. So right here, we have a map, and it's probably very difficult to see, and it's showing deaths of COVID-19 in nursing homes and assisted living facilities throughout the United States. I don't know if everyone remembers, but we first started hearing about COVID in a SNF, skilled nursing facility in Washington State. It cascaded across the United States, and in Massachusetts, 77% of all deaths from COVID was in or related to long-term care facilities. Staff became ill. Families were not allowed to visit, and really fear became our constant companion. Staff were afraid, residents were afraid, families were very afraid. And society at large had a high level of anxiety. You know, we had residents who were continually watching the news, who was getting the information from that. So we had staff that was very afraid for their families, themselves. We were balancing sensitivity to resident needs and staff needs. And plus, we were dealing with grief and fear, and a lot of information that we didn't have at the time. So we really didn't have as much of an understanding, thank goodness, as we do now. Next slide, please. The bad is the loneliness. Our residents became despondent, they became lonely, and they were confused and afraid, as I said earlier. We worked very hard to engage our residents, even though they were in their rooms for the most part. They were dining in their rooms. They were really not allowed to leave their rooms initially until we were able to establish a plan for a type of socialization and activities. For a period, activities were stopped, community dining was stopped, and probably one of the most important things to most of the residents in long-term care facilities is the hairdresser was stopped. So no one was coming in except for staff. Family visits were stopped. We continued to allow clinical providers to come in, such as hospice, but we were certainly monitoring that very, very closely. We often had new people. We brought in additional staff. When someone would test positive for COVID, we too had contract staff in. We had to go through the process of training them, orienting them, and doing everything that Nick just indicated at Lowell. So we had, but the impact on our residents was loneliness. Who is this person? There was no relationship. We did try. We did try to engage our residents. We started things like hallway bingo. We purchased iPads and used technology for visits. We really tried, and staff worked overtime to try and engage our residents. We had our activities and programming staff. Some folks were working 7 days a week, 10 to 12 hours a day, trying to do visits. We created really activity packets, if you will. I'm not a big fan of that during normal times because I never want it to be, childlike. But we were able to create adult-based activity packets with adult coloring books and things of that nature. So loneliness and fear and confusion was paramount, during that time. Next slide, please. The good. Right here, you're looking at a picture, if you can't see, family members from NEHD, New England Homes for the Deaf, holding a banner saying, "We love you." They made it to celebrate staff. Families and the community had parades of cars come in. They would have a staff appreciation parade, and cars from the community, fire trucks, police trucks. It was really appreciated. It was really, you saw the little signs, "Heroes work here." We had shirts, t-shirts made for our staff about being heroes during the global pandemic. But the family support was really key. I started doing Zoom family meetings every 2 weeks to really communicate with the families. What I learned is families wanted to really connect, not with, and at that time I was working for a moderately large assisted living company. Letters would come out from the home office, from the president or the chief operating officer, which was great. The families didn't really care about that. Respectfully, they wanted to hear from me. They wanted to know what was going on at the local facility with their family member. Are they safe? And what are they doing? How's their isolation? I continued those family meetings every 2 weeks. I learned a lot about, I created relationships with families. It was amazing. I learned what the life of a horse vet in Washington State was like, who was a family member. My attendance at family meetings, I would have a family meeting pre-pandemic in person. If I had 15 people, it was a great night. It was a full family meeting. I had 40 to 50 people on my calls every 2 weeks. That communication and that enhanced relationship, that creativity, it was a different relationship, but I learned that virtual relationships, while in my opinion are not quite as meaningful as in-person relationships, I learned that virtual relationships can be meaningful, impactful, and great communication can take place. And I would update the families on new policies, new directives from DPH, from the CDC. My disclaimer at every one of the meetings was, what I'm telling you right now is true right now. A week from now, I may be telling you something else. So certainly relationships, the family support was something good that came out of the pandemic, during the pandemic. And when I would get on those calls and hear, honestly, and there were some really discouraging days, but when I would get on those calls and hear from family members about the appreciation, about what they said, it was moving, and it moved me moved me to tears, and I've done this for a very long time. So it was really meaningful. Next slide, please. The good, staff going beyond. Right here's a picture of our medical director and a care provider with the medical director blooms in, grateful for all you do. Job descriptions became less important, and we looked at who had the ability to do the job, do it well, and could provide the care for the patient, for the resident. Initially, my job radically changed. I was the PPE guru. I was counting PPE daily, 7 days a week. I had physical therapy, occupational therapy, and speech therapy providing care. One night, a resident tested positive on a Saturday night for COVID and NEHD. Within an hour, our maintenance director, our unit manager, our DNS came in and was sealing off the area with tape and with appropriate material to create a space separate for the COVID positive resident. And we were having conference calls 7 days a week to touch base at 10 a.m. For those that was off, they could call in because we were all working a modified schedule to get it done. Next slide, please. So right here is the NEHD leadership team. These are our facilities heroes. We had, as I said, job descriptions kind of went away to a degree. Our HR director was helping feed residents. As a leader, staff burnout was a huge concern. Some staff did leave. It was too much. And we also had to try and balance, it was affecting us, me included. So we had to try and balance our family needs with operational and resident needs. Next slide, please. So what did we learn? How did we change? Did we change? Did this change societal impact of long-term care? Well, we return to things that were in the pre-pandemic world. We go back to business as normal. Next slide, please. The future. I believe we learned 4 key things. Entrepreneurship. We became much more creative. We felt we had to adopt an entrepreneurial attitude. We became people who were good at sourcing PPE. We became creative with scheduling. The traditional 7 to 3, 3 to 11, and 11 to 7 often went away. We had permanent assignments because we had the COVID team and the COVID positive team and the non-COVID positive team for those residents. We had them permanently getting to know those residents and saw the benefit of permanent assignments, even though we already knew it. The 4 things that I'm proposing are nothing new. But with that said, there are things that we became important and continues to be important. Disaster plan. How many of us thought, oh, that's good to sit down and have our safety meeting or disaster review? We did our cursory obligatory meeting, but we thought this probably is not going to happen. One of the reasons I'm honored to be involved in this organization is it's important for us to coordinate. It's important to have community partnerships, which I'll speak about briefly in a moment. But it's important for us to take disaster planning seriously. It's important for us to utilize our partners and our regulatory requirements. The workforce is not static. There's an article in the Harvard Business Review about the Great Resignation. Workers have options. We saw that during the pandemic. We see that now. Probably the greatest impact and the greatest challenge in long-term care right now is not lack of business, not lack of patients, not lack of residents, but getting staff, enough staff to care for the residents, qualified staff, and retaining those staff. We have to throw away the old way of doing things, and the pandemic helped us see that. Also, community partnerships. It's good to have those partnerships beforehand, but sometimes they have to evolve and develop as a result of something like a global pandemic. Partnerships include faith communities, pharmacy, ambulance, cleanup companies. We have to really focus on our community and think through who we may need to help and who may need to help us. We're not an island. That is how I see the future of long-term care and what we learned from the pandemic. In 25 years, I thought I had seen everything in healthcare leadership. So, and a lot of times my staff laugh because I'm calm through it all. I'm like, oh yeah, that's fine. The pandemic was certainly something new that none of us had ever dealt with. Certainly we did learn things. Certainly we'll never be the same. And certainly we continue to deal with pandemic issues. Next slide, please. So at the end, we'll have the opportunity for questions. There's my contact information, my email, as well as my cell phone. Thank you for your time and for listening, and hopefully there was some helpful information. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Chuck.
Thank you.
Yeah, as Chuck mentioned, please place all questions in the chat and we'll get to those. And up next, so we have our last presenter for today, who's Bill. So Bill is the Emergency Preparedness Coordinator and EMS Coordinator for North Shore Medical Center. He is also a registered paramedic with over 20 years of experience in the field. So go ahead and turn it over to Bill.
Thank you, and thanks everybody. From stories about things we've encountered and lessons that we've learned comes a story about a lesson we have yet to learn. Something on the horizon, potentially right now. A pediatric disaster. Kids right now are the only members of our population that cannot be vaccinated against COVID-19. Kids are the members of our population that have to be in highly populated, close environments, AKA schools or sports, close to each other. They need that. Next slide, please. Just a little fact that brought me to think about discussing this is that in 2019, there were over 73 million children in the United States, making up to 22% of our nation's population. 73 million kids. Next slide, please. That's a lot of kids. Children are not just young adults. They need entirely different approaches to medical care. They are not as resilient as adults are. They haven't been through enough. Once something gets a hold of a child's body medically or pathologically, it really can destroy things and everything around it, including the lives of their parents, families, caregivers, and communities. Next, please. And this is what they have to do today. Imagine all these kids exposed to a variant of the coronavirus or some other virus that has yet to be melted from the polar ice caps. That's been hidden up there for thousands of years. Something that destroyed other living things on the planet eons ago that we don't even know about. That makes them specifically and especially vulnerable. Not only as individuals with pre-existing conditions, which I think there was a statistic that a high percent of children, almost half, currently have pre-existing conditions that make them vulnerable to a variant. Caring for kids in the clinical setting evokes emotions that are akin to being in fight or flight all the time. We're talking about burnout of staff in EMS and in hospitals and long-term care now. Imagine if they had to care for children at the numbers that they were caring for adults recently. Imagine if they were overwhelmed with sick and vulnerable children and the emotional response that evokes in them, in addition to being exposed to caring for their parents. Because when you just care for a kid, you're not just caring for a kid, you're caring for their family as well, because they are there all the time. Go ahead, Beth. Oh, there it is. 54% of American children have one or more chronic health conditions already. These are the people that we're saying in adults are more vulnerable, are more at risk for serious disease from the coronavirus, from the variants, and from the other viruses that, again, we may not even know about. Go ahead, Beth. I think some of these I just wanted to be quiet for. Just think about it. Next. What a children's floor in a hospital looks like when it's full. The amount of care that a vulnerable child, an infant, would need, the amount of support, the amount of resources, the amount of staffing. These are 3 highly trained individuals for one patient right now. Go ahead. And it's never just the patient when it's a kid. There's always a parent. Next. This is a snapshot of numbers from our region's hospitals from the first spring of COVID-19 for adults. Some pretty high numbers. I didn't get a slide of what the current pediatric capacity is, but it's nowhere near this. If we even had 22% of these numbers for each hospital in our region alone, we have nowhere near the capacity. I think we figured out, Beth, correct me if I'm wrong, we have 3 hospitals in Region 3 with inpatient pediatric capabilities for medical.
Correct.
And only one of them was an ICU, is that right?
I believe none of them are ICU.
So 0 ICU level in our region for pediatric patients. I'm going to do some guesswork and say that each one of those hospitals doesn't have capacity above 15 for pediatrics. I know that we all just were invited to participate in a statewide and nationwide pediatric preparedness survey. I don't know if any of you saw the answers or felt the answers you were giving, but a lot of the answers that I saw, heard, and got were, we don't do pediatrics. And then when they were followed up with the questions of, but what if there was an emergency and we had to? There weren't any answers for that. This is a huge gap, not only in our region, but across the entire world. That's why we're having those surveys done. That's why we're starting to think about this. Something's going to have to be done. It is one of the priorities for the ASPR grant for preparedness in hospital healthcare this year. And there is a pediatric disaster preparedness course being offered in the beginning of November. If you are invited or you have the chance, I suggest you get involved and become your agency's champion somehow. Go ahead, next slide, Beth. Children are also not as easy to control or herd. If there is a pediatric mass casualty incident, it's just going to be pandemonium. I don't know if any of you ever considered being a teacher, but there's probably a reason you didn't become one. Go ahead, next. Some of the things we have been doing in our region, though, to get ready, prepare for something like this, obviously nowhere near to the right levels, is we have purchased for each hospital some pediatric surge kits. And these are the items that we store in there ready to possibly open a pediatric area or staff an area for pediatrics or supply an area for pediatrics. I should not have said staff, sorry, because I don't know if anyone's going to be able to do that. But you know, things that kids are going to need: changing pads, diapers, bathing bins, bed sheets for cribs, Broslo tapes, pediatric dosing cards, baby soap, hand sanitizer, washcloths, towels, breast pumps, all the things you'd need for infants and moms for a couple of days. Okay, next. Another product we all purchased, and we have several of them throughout the region, is a pediatric mod. It is a prefabbed supply kit for opening a pediatric care case. And I believe the goal is for 20 patients for up to 48 hours. In a short-term event, this is a great start. In a long-term event, it's going to go really, really quickly. But again, we've been thinking about this for a while, a little bit, and starting to talk about it, and we're starting to gather some materials. Next, we have to really shore up some plans and make a plan collectively for something that will definitely affect the region if it gets to this point. Go ahead, next. Some of the other items that we're doing over at Salem Hospital, when we created the new ER, we specifically made a rear hallway that nothing would go in except for beds, and that would be an area that we expand into in a surge. As you can see, we have some infant items. Those are the only 2 items we have. Go ahead, next.
That's all the slides you have.
It is.
It is.
Oh, I thought there was a video. There should have been a video link in the last slide. Okay, anyway, that would have gotten a laugh out of everybody. So I wanted to close with the end scene from Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. When Indy and Willie come back over the rise to the Indian village and hand over the stones to the shaman. And then he turns around, and of course, then the music starts, and you see all the women pop up from their work throughout the village and the fields. And the Indian music starts, and a sea of children are unleashed on the village after he freed them. And the mothers are screaming and running through the crowd and calling out their children's names and pushing aside the children that aren't theirs and calling their children's names. And I wanted to leave you with 2 words: family reunification. Another nightmare of a pediatric disaster. I'm sorry I can't end on a good note, but we're not ready for this. We have to start talking about it. We have to start doing things. And we have to start thinking about what it's going to look like. Other than that, have a great day. Thanks.
Thanks, Bill. And thanks to all of our presenters that presented today. I don't see any questions in the chat at the moment, but does anyone have a question that they have not placed in the chat yet? Not seeing any. We are close. We're at actually almost at the time to end. So again, I want to thank everyone for presenting today. If any of our stakeholders have any questions, or later on, or something comes up, you're looking for anybody's contact information of anybody that spoke today, please feel free to reach out to Dan or I. We can provide that information to you all. And we will be, once we can get this downloaded, we will get it and posted on our website for people to go back and look onto. So again, I just want to thank everyone, our panelists, and then all of our members for joining us today. I think it was really valuable to be able to show, all the, well, we are just, we're one region, and all of the successes that have happened, within the region over the past 18 months. So really great. So again, thanks everyone, and look forward to seeing you all soon.